one of my patrons, Dries is his name, got in touch with a question, which is how to work out what module to get next. You maybe got a hole in your system. How do you work out what to put in it? And Dries' question goes like this. I'm someone who has no musical experience, not in the slightest. And in Eurorack, there are thousands and thousands of modules. It's an overload. How do I pick through this and work out what to buy next? And I think in this question is like a whole ocean of things to talk about with regard to obviously the buying cycle, and the fact that Eurorack is it's a tempting format because of course there are so many things that you can potentially get for it. How can you stop and just like use what you have? And what point is the right point to think, maybe actually I should be putting something new in my system? It's not an easy one, and I'm sure many people have different strategies, and I want to talk about some of them here, especially also that thing of trying to pick through. If you do feel that there is something that you need, how will you arrive at it? I mean, one answer to that is you can literally use Modulargrid, and you can sort on Modulargrid by the type of module you want, and you can sort by popularity. As I've said before in other videos, like that isn't a bad way of finding other examples of popular modules. But what if you've just got like a hole in your system and you're like, what could go here? What's the really brilliant thing that will solve my musical problems? And I feel like within that question, I think that's a little bit of what Dries is getting at, because if you have no musical experience and if you're new to the Eurorack, then you may not know. You may not even know what to look for on Modulargrid. And to this, I would suggest many things, but my default answer is you should use your system. You know, if you have a hole, you should be making music with that system in whatever way, shape or form that might be. Because if you try and use the system in anger to make music, then I think you're likely to come up against naturally the issues that tell you what should be in that hole. Through use, you butt up against those things that you are actually trying to do. And one approach to use that I think is worth thinking about, because, you know, in use, you are an untrained musician. Maybe you're not using it as broadly as you potentially feel you could. My suggestion is have a go at making sample packs with your modular, especially if you're like new in this game or, you know, early in your cycle. Obviously, even if you're not and you've just not really done this before, you know, a small modular, that is something that doesn't do a lot by itself and that only potentially makes one sound at once. It is the greatest source of sample material, and that I feel is its greatest use, because you can just record one thing after another, after another, after another, and build a library of sounds. Another approach I would suggest to do that with is to have a target amount of sounds in a target set of categories. Creating a list and saying, in my sample pack that I am going to make, I will have X number of these sounds, those sounds, and those sounds. You know, sub bass, bass, leads, slow attack strings, kick, snare, open, closed hi-hat, weird percussive sounds, risers, drones. That could be a list of sounds with X number in, as many or as little as you want. And I would suggest not having that many. But with that list, you then go and actually use your system to try and make a broad range of sounds. And hopefully, because that set of sounds is broad, you would then butt up against the kinds of things that your system isn't capable of. Although I would suspect that in many respects you'll find that you can do a great many things. And while you may not arrive at the sound that you had in mind, if you had one, you'll arrive at something else that's equally interesting and curious. And you'll learn things about your system that you didn't know it could produce. So to summarize that, it's this idea that I think making a sound pack where you have a predetermined list of things to make, I think is just a really good, healthy, interesting thing to do with a modular synth, full stop. And I think it's especially useful if you're not sure where to go next with your modular. It works if you have a really small system. In fact, it'll make you feel good about having a small system, because you will realize how much you can get from it. In fact, you can get everything from a very small system that can only do one thing at once, and it might require lots of creative patching and multing of things to make full use of all of the things that are there. And it will require creative workarounds that, you'd initially think, I'll have to buy something to do that. But actually, there might be a way of getting close, and you'll learn something in the process. But I want to go on and talk a bit about the whole, buying stuff. I contribute enormously to this curse of buying things, because a lot of the time I make demos of gear, and I am making a demo that's job is to basically explain why something is good. I don't make videos about things that I think are bad, because, well, there aren't really bad bits of gear, but there are certainly things that I've turned down because for various reasons they weren't ready, or I didn't think were suitable for whatever reason. But that's very rare, because gear is good on the whole. I know that's a very boring thing to say, but it's true. Gear is made by a whole team of people who care passionately about a product. That doesn't mean that it's perfect, and especially close to release. It's very common that there are problems with gear, like bugs and beta stuff that's being ironed out right into the last minute, and sometimes literally after release, you get kind of day one patches. Same as in computer games, things like that. It's a very similar thing. Stuff gets worked on right up to the last minute. And that means that, as a person like myself who receives a bit of gear to make a video about, there have been times where I've been like, I don't want to make a video because this is not ready. But that just is not that common. Gear mostly is really good. And so I think there's you can kind of be confident that most things do what they say they are supposed to do, with not many exceptions, I don't think. But I think there's still this kind of cycle of temptedness, this cycle of if onlyism, which is just, it's so human. And I suffer from it all the time. Around me is a room full of equipment, which I've amassed over the last 25 years, thinking that something will be interesting, will be offer some quirky perspective, some interesting way of making music that might just be the way. It may just be it, and it might, it is possible. But I think if you look at the studios of our most favorite electronic musicians, the common thread is not an enormous amount of equipment, but a small amount of equipment. Have you noticed, if you look at Aphex Twin's Cyro, round liner notes, where you can see all of the things, a massive, massive, massive collection of gear, a king's ransom of high-end and low-end gear used to make Cyro. But note that in that little circle, all the actual tracks are made up of a small fragment of gear that have been carefully chosen and assembled. A small cluster is actually what Mr. Richard D. James makes his tracks from, not everything all at once. And so the most important thing is to think not about how much gear you can get away with making music with, but how little you can. And that's easier said than done because of this huge temptation for just one thingism. But I think that the antidote has to be some kind of discipline to your approach to researching gear and using gear. I think there is should be a buy mode and a use mode. You've got a switch on the back of your head, and in one mode you're in buy mode, and it's okay for you to research things and think about what it is that you want to do. But that switch must be flicked. there has to be a use mode. You cannot exclusively dedicate your life to buy mode or leave that buy mode switch turned on when really you need to be in use mode. And I think that is very, very hard. We love forums. We love connecting with other people and seeing what's new and interesting. And speaking personally for this discussion is really me talking about myself as much as this attempting to offer advice. This is what's going on in my head because I'm just the same. Can't you see? And then, you know, we have to basically separate these processes. And so there has to be a moment. The example of this, as I've said before, was I saw Tim Hecker. It was Tim Hecker. Tim Hecker separates the buying from the using process. Tim Hecker will work out what it is that he is going to make music with and what his project is going to be. And then Tim Hecker goes to his virtual or literal or metaphorical cabin in the woods and makes a record with that setup. And then after that's done, Tim Hecker flicks the switch and you're back into research and what's next mode. There's another interesting approach that I want to mention, which I've seen a few other people do, which I should be clear, it's not something I'm clever enough to do myself. Other people have suggested this, which is make it your business to research and get gas for the things that you already own. That is to say, learning new things about what you already have is just such a wonderful and sensational approach to obsessing about equipment. And I do think that's the sort of thing that making a sample pack, using your modular, is the kind of activity that's going to foster that sort of surprise, because inevitably you'll be potentially doing different types of things with your modular than you had done before, pushing it to make different sounds than you were aware that it was possible for it to make. So that's going to just foster a kind of surprise and delight and broaden your experience in sound creation as a result. But what if you are watching videos about new things and you get excited about that new thing and you think, I need the new thing to do this new thing? Well, this is the other thing. And I've seen so many brilliant comments on videos that I've made, and they're some of my favorite, because what people will say is, I love this video, I really enjoyed it. Always nice when people say that. But they would say, I'm probably not going to get this thing, but I learned something, an idea in how it worked that I'm going to adapt and make my own version of. And that is just like music to my ears, because ultimately, literally the point of me making videos is to inspire you to make music. Like, I want people to make music. And so if that means that you're watching a gear video and that what you do is not buy the thing, but it inspires you to find a new way to make music, and that is just like, that's really the goal. And so, for example, you know, whatever it may be, you might be looking at a video about like the Arturia Mini Freak or something like that and being like, it does cool things with wavetables now, you know? And it might be that you are thinking, I wish I had like a wavetable module, and you don't have one. You might start to think, how can I make a wavetable module from the modules that I already own? And you might say, I've got a sequential switch, and if I plug like the 4 waveforms from different oscillators into different of like the 4 inputs of the sequential switch, and then move between them, sequentially switch between them at really, really high speed, then I'll get something like this kind of weird wavetable, like kind of shifting sound. Or you might say, oh, like I want it to crossfade, and so I can't do that with a sequential switch. I haven't got one either, but I have got 4 VCAs and 4 LFOs, and so I could output the 4 waveforms through the VCAs and then use LFOs to sort of bring them in and out, you know? So they'd crossfade between each other, and they're not quadrature, so they don't do this in a really organized fashion. They're going to be a bit wonky, and kind of like the LFOs, I'm going to have to manually trim them, but it'll sound cool. Like it'll sound like a cool sound. Well, that's it. So I'm also advocating this idea of thinking about videos as a kind of provocation to inspire a patch. And you must remember, you can prototype things in VCV Rack for free using modules way beyond what you may own or likely to own, so that you could use VCV as a way of, you know, exploring something without making a financial commitment, trying ideas, thinking, would that work? You know, you can very quickly prototype things in there and try out ideas without having to buy anything. Although that might then inspire a purchase that is sensible when you think, I really can't do this without a thing. But what I'm trying to say here is there probably is a hacky way of doing that thing, and it's more creative. But you had to have that thought process. So, yeah. I would also mention finally this idea of buying bans, which is something I've enacted before. Just enact a buying ban. For 6 months, whatever it may be, you're banned from buying things. But you're not banned necessarily from learning about what you already have. Or if you are watching videos about new gear, then you are able to take ideas from them and see if you can make a hacky, weird version of it in your own way. Like, you may fail, and the failure will be interesting and will teach you something and maybe take you down a rabbit hole of discovery that will be worthwhile. One quick little tip though, with regard to having buying bans, you will just inevitably think of things that you're like, mustn't forget about that awesome thing, want that awesome thing, that could be interesting to research later, even if I'm not permitted to think much more about it at this point. Well, have like a buying list on your phone. Have a place where you can just write the stupid thing, whatever it is, and then forget about it. Because in doing so, it gets it out of your mind. You're not obliged to keep thinking about it. You basically get that weird little like dopamine hit of the thing and thinking, oh, you know, I'll get it someday, you think. But by writing it down, it just sort of sidesteps that thing. And then you can give yourself time to think about it, reflect on it. And obviously, in this instance, think carefully about the types of things that it teaches you. What ideas can you glean from that piece of equipment that you might be able to apply in a slightly hacky but really interesting way using things that you already have? The essence of creativity is putting existing things together in new ways. So here's to putting things together in new ways in 2025. I have a Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, please consider signing up. But above all, make music and have fun. Thanks.